Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're listening from. I'm Caroline Kabiru, and I head the Population Dynamics and Sexual and Reproductive Health Program at the African Population and Health Research Center in Nairobi, Kenya. I'm pleased to share a few reflections on the effects of COVID-19 on the lives of adolescents and specifically on their sexual and reproductive health. The data gathered so far on the COVID-19 pandemic indicates that children and adolescents are at a relatively lower risk for COVID-19 related morbidity and mortality compared to adult populations. However, the resultant measures to contain the spread of the virus, such as lockdowns, school closures, and shifts in health service provision, may have significant indirect impacts on other aspects of their health and well-being, including their sexual and reproductive health and rights, both in the short term and in the long term. The research conducted by organizations like the Population Council and partnerships like the Gender and Adolescents Global Evidence or GAGE initiative highlight some of these indirect impacts of the pandemic on the lives of adolescents. They report from their research that adolescents talk about disruptions in education and learning, increased risk of sexual and gender-based violence, including child marriage and possibly female genital mutilation and other harmful traditional practices. Young people also talk about poor mental health stemming from issues such as social isolation, anxiety about COVID-19, and increased stress. Young people also report loss of employment, both for themselves and for adults in their homes, as well as lost livelihoods and food insecurity. So far, the research shows that these immediate impacts are not uniformly experienced by all adolescents. There are differences by sex, there are differences by marital status, there are differences by socioeconomic status and other attributes. These differences raise concerns that the COVID-19 pandemic will worsen inequalities already seen in indicators of adolescent health and well-being in different settings globally. As countries respond to the crisis, it's important that they prioritize adolescent subpopulations who are likely to be hardest hit by the effects. We also collectively need to think about the longer-term impacts of these intermediate and immediate effects on adolescents and put in place programs to mitigate any negative effects. So what do I mean? So for example, across the globe and in many countries, schools were closed down with disruptions in education and learning. These could lead to longer term impacts in terms of poorer educational outcomes, including school dropouts, which we know from previous research might have sexual and reproductive health repercussions. So we need to be thinking about what measures do we put in place to ensure that, for example, all adolescents whose education has been disrupted during this period are able to go back to school. Now, because of the relative recency of the pandemic, we know little about the effects of the pandemic on sexual and reproductive health. However, estimates from models computed by the Guttmacher Institute highlight significant potential impacts among adolescents in terms of access to contraceptive services, risks of major obstetric complications, and unsafe abortions. Further, we know from previous crises and pandemics and epidemics, such as the Ebola crisis that occurred in West Africa several years back, that the health crisis and the resultant measures put in place to contain the spread can lead to adolescent pregnancy and subsequent school dropouts with longer-term implications for adolescent health and well-being. There is also some evidence about the potential impacts or effects of the pandemic on other aspects of adolescent sexual and reproductive health. For example, the research conducted by the Population Council highlights limited access to menstrual management products reported by some of the adolescents, which based on our previous research could lead to increased involvement in transactional sex. There's still a lot that we do not know about the longer-term effects of the pandemic on adolescent health, and further research is critical to inform programming. Yet, to fully understand these impacts, we need stronger data systems that would enable us to better understand the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic and similar crises, as well as to monitor and evaluate the measures or programs that are put in place to mitigate those negative effects. We also need to think about how we add an equity lens to such data systems so that they capture the most vulnerable adolescent subpopulations, since we know that the effects of the pandemic are not uniformly felt. Finally, the range of observed and expected impacts underscore the need for multi-sectoral action, both to fully understand the impacts as well as to address these impacts. How best to achieve this action, this multi-sectoral action, is a largely unanswered question that's worth further reflection. With that, I end and thank you for your attention, and I wish you all the best as you complete the course. Thank you.